Did you know that Peter Dinklage was in a band before he got his big break? That's actually how he got his scar, because he was in like a punk rock ska band and he was known for going ham on stage and going crazy. He used to play like the trumpet. I just feel like this is lore that's not discussed enough when it comes to Peter Dinklage. One of the top things I get asked as someone with dwarfism is my thoughts on Tyrion Lannister and Peter Dinklage, and that's a question I get asked in real life, online, and it's not even just me. I know lots of little people too who people come up to them foaming at the mouths being like, Peter Dinklage? Tyrion Lannister? Shout out to his standum because y'all are very dedicated to the cause. Y'all love that man. I also get asked a lot about what I feel about dwarves as a fantasy race and characters with dwarfism in fantasy worlds, whether that's offensive, whether that's good representation, bad representation, etc., etc. So I figured why not in today's video, because I'm in a very chatty mood, guys, so be forewarned. Today's been a lot, okay? But before I do, please go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment letting me know how you guys are. I love connecting with you guys, especially now that TikTok's going away. I just want to be able to stay in touch, you know? And me talking to the camera doesn't really feel very personal sometimes, so drop a little my cat came in the room. Oh my god, and I just saw a black shadow crawling on the floor next to me. Oh. Peter Dinklage, as many of you guys know, has strayed away in recent years from stereotypical roles that are based around his disability, which is dwarfism. He has the most common form of dwarfism called achondroplasia, and he's talked at length about for how a lot of his career in the early days he was faced with roles that were objectifying. So roles that the whole point of him being there was to highlight, look, it's a little person. And it took him a lot of, many years of not accepting jobs at a certain point because he started refusing that work. And he's definitely dabbled into the stereotypical dwarf roles before, as many of us know, from like Tiptoes to Elf. But Game of Thrones was really the first time that he got to have a role that was more down his alley. He's a more serious, dramatic actor. And although I've never seen all of Game of Thrones, I've done a lot of research on the character. And I honestly think this is one of the best modern representations of dwarfism, especially in a more prominent role in film and TV. And he was actually apprehensive with taking this role at first because of how oftentimes dwarves in fantasy are portrayed in a kind of mystical, kind of weird way, and he just was not about that life, and I don't blame him, to be quite honest. But this role ended up being really nice for him. He actually is the most awarded actor from Game of Thrones when it comes to accolades and awards for his character and his participation in the show. But as a dwarfism historian, what I find really fascinating and what I love about this character is whether J.R.R. Martin intended. Is it J.R.R. or J.R. Martin? I'm sure he won't mind. But regardless if this character was written to be based on historical people with dwarfism, there's actually a lot of resemblances in the story of Tyrion and his character's art and real little people who have lived throughout history and served as court dwarves. If you guys don't know what that is, done a whole video on the history of little people which covers it, but essentially they were little people that were collected by people in power to serve them as entertainment or pets in their court, essentially like human toys. Very strange. But there were some who were quite badass, just like Tyrion. There was one who even fought on behalf of the queen in a war, and it's a whole lore in itself. But I see so many similarities between some little people who served as court dwarves and Tyrion's character. And I think that even though there are some moments where, there are derogatory marks thrown Tyrion's way or his heights clowned upon in some way, I think they are at least based in real experiences that little people have. And I think that they're justified in that sense because it provides accurate insight into what it would be like to live as someone with dwarfism. And I think those reminders where his height is called out are good reminders for audiences to remember how people with dwarfism are treated. I think that those jokes pull people out of his character a little bit, and they're like, oh wow, it's crazy that people would say that to Tyrion Lannister. And I think that is just a great reminder because so many little people get those comments every day where people are like, I forgot you had dwarfism, because of how much that ultimately doesn't play into our personalities and how we, our views on the world. So when people start calling out our height or make ableist jokes or make fun of us for having dwarfism, sometimes people we know are like, why would someone do that? Because they're so used to seeing us as a person and not a little person. Peter Dinklage's portrayal of Tyrion moved the needle forward in so many different regards, from just providing better exposure of the dwarfism community and showing a different side of characters with dwarfism that we've never seen in popular media before. But it also has provided opportunities when it comes to casting casting directors now being like, oh, you know what? Game of Thrones did really well with having diverse casting in that regard. Let's start calling in some more little people. And especially with Peter Dinklage, who operates in a very professional and dignified manner, he's really put a good taste in people's mouths, per se. So the industry itself has really re-examined their stereotypes they've associated with little people. They've re-examined how they look at, the potential for our characters and actors in our community. And then on the flip side, audiences have also realized that we don't need to think of little people as the seven dwarves or Oompa Loompas anymore. We now have another completely opposite spectrum of dwarfism representation that we can refer to when we're talking about characters who are little people. And before, we really didn't have that. We had the mini-me, we had Oompa Loompas, we had munchkins, like we had these kind of fantasy, one-dimensional caricatures of little people that were so far removed from actual people with dwarfism and so dehumanizing that we really didn't have characters that felt human and real. When it comes to dwarfism and fantasy in general, I think there's a few good examples of dwarfism representation that I wanted to bring up. I would love to do a video on some of these specifically, but I figured it would be good to touch on them in general. Before I do, I just have to say, because people always are like, are dwarves in fantasy offensive? And I always am just like so confused to where that came from, but I think it's because of some of the modern portrayals of dwarf races in fantasy that might rely on like stereotype with like the bearded women and like the grumpiness and all of that stuff. And I just have to remind people that dwarves in fantasy never originated as little people or people with dwarfism. They never looked like little people. They were never described as looking like little people. Quite the opposite, actually. Over time, some representations of dwarf races in fantasy have depicted these characters as people who actually have dwarfism. That's a whole different discussion. In Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, you have actual characters modeled after little people, in which case there's more of a connection there. But inherently, dwarves in fantasy and races of dwarves don't always have to be little people and aren't always supposed to be. I know sometimes people message me and they're like, oh, in this video game or in this TV show there's a dwarf race, but they're not little people. Is that erasure of your community? And it's like, no, it's actually accurate. And I just think that's important to note. And if you want to know more about that, I'll put some resources below with some history so you can get some more factual information for the future. But my favorite example of dwarfism representation in fantasy is Willow, starring the icon, the legend himself, Warwick Davis. But my favorite example of dwarfism representation in the fantasy space is Willow, which came out in 1988 and was made by Lucasfilms and directed by Ron Howard. And it starred Warwick Davis as a sorcerer with dwarfism. Is that a spoiler? I don't know. It's been out for like 50 years. But he filmed the movie when he was 17 years old, and the way that it all came to be, actually, is that when he was a teenager, 13, I believe, is when he first starred in Star Wars as an Ewok stunt performer, and he was just so loved and so talented on set that George Lucas was like, I'm gonna write that guy a movie. And actually, a fun fact, originally in A New Hope, Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker, and Luke's aunt and uncle were all gonna be little people. Isn't that crazy? He auditioned them and did screen tests even. I need to see that footage. But eventually they just couldn't make it work, and he still wanted to find a way to incorporate actors with dwarfism, which I really commend him for, because he obviously saw that that was a talent pool that had been untouched. So he incorporated little people regardless in Star Wars in a variety of different roles, but he was really adamant about writing something for Warwick Davis, and a few years later, Willow was greenlit and went into production and became a cult classic all of these years later. And what I love about Willow is not only did it break The Wizard of Oz's record for the most amount of little people called in for a movie, because it had, I think, like over 200, close to 300 little people. And although these characters with dwarfism were considered a race, a different separate race in this world of Willow, I think that the way they handled it was really beautiful. I think they really showed not only just like a diverse group of people with dwarfism, because so often we just see one type of looking little person. Usually it's like a white guy in his like 40s. So we saw a really great mix of younger and older and different colors of little people. But I also just thought it showed a great example of how strong little people can be as well. I think sometimes people equate our height with not being capable and also being weaker, when we are some of the most talented and strong people out there. you know? And especially not only in the movie is Willow himself a character that shows enormous growth and bravery. He goes up against sorcerers, against like goblin trolls. There's lots of like chases from the bad guys and stunt scenes and fight scenes. He's just going all over the place. But filming the movie took so much energy and work as well. That was no easy feat, and they absolutely proved. Tony Cox, Warwick Davis, Billy Barty. There were so many icons from the dwarfism community that started in that film that really were living proof that the talent pool of the dwarfism community is vast and capable and can keep up with Val Kilmer and all of these other action adventure stars that starred in the film. And I personally think that the plot for Willow still holds up to this day. Like, you mean to tell me that there's a movie about a magic sorcerer, little person going on an epic quest in a fantasy world and fighting evil sorcerers and goblins and monsters and saving a baby from evil and harm? Yeah, sign me up. Add that to my AMC A-list. Warwick Davis also starred in The 10th Kingdom, which I think is also a really great example of dwarfism representation in the fantasy genre. I think that's also something that a lot of you guys mentioned to me as well. And things like 10th Kingdom and Willow do a great job at establishing a world, establishing these characters, establishing their strengths and weaknesses, and that's all we need. It's all we ask for. When it comes to stuff like The Hobbit, I don't think, because I know that some people are aware of the fact that they used little people as body doubles for the Hobbit characters who are supposed to be of small stature. And I don't really think that falls into necessarily the offensive genre. I think a lot of people assume it's offensive. It starred some really talented stunt doubles with dwarfism, like Kieran Shaw, who doubled for Elijah Wood, and some other people. And these are seasoned professionals who had a really hard task, actually, to completely mimic the mannerisms of the actors that they were doubling for so that it could be a seamless transition for the audience and for the editors. The characters they were doubling for weren't supposed to be little people. They were just supposed to be smaller in size, which is different ultimately. It's kind of in the same realm of like Hugh Grant as an Oompa Loompa. The role was originally played by little people, but in Wonka the prequel, he's too small to be an actual little person. So I think it's like kind of like muddy ground a little bit in the same way that The Hobbit is, where it's like those aren't supposed to be little people. Like, they're not supposed to be people with dwarfism, you know? They ended up using people with dwarfism to achieve the desired effects, but they aren't supposed to resemble little people. So I think that is an example of dwarfism in fantasy that I don't think is a problem, and I don't think should be considered a problem. Obviously, not every little person's gonna feel the same. I cannot speak for them all. Don't say Aubrey Sproul speaks on behalf of the dwarfism community. I think you do have some characters with I keep wanting to call them dwarf characters, but when the whole point is them just being a little person. I think on the other side of the spectrum, though, some of like the not so good dwarfism representation in fantasy comes from the Narnia series that they did from 2005 on. It may have been earlier than 2005, don't sue me. But that starred Kieran Shaw as the sidekick to Tilda Swinton's evil queen, Snow Queen. I forget her character's name. And also with Peter Dinklage later on. And I think that those are some levels of dwarfism representation that aren't as positive. Just because, even just like in the original text, these are very surface level characters that really are relying on the fact that they're dwarves. And I think that they rely a lot on specifically the stereotypes associated with characters with dwarfism in fantasy worlds, where they're grumpier, they have beards, and they're just relying on, you know, stereotypes that have existed within the genre. So I think those are some of the not great ones. Do I think they're offensive? No. Do I think that there should be other opportunities for little people in these series? Yes. I think that absolutely, like Greta Gerwig, they just announced that she's doing Narnia and it's gonna be on IMAX and everything. And my first thought was like, please don't try to be like overly sensitive and not include little people because you're scared of offending the community. Just hire a co-writer with dwarfism to do a few passes on the script, because there are characters with dwarfism in the original book, and I can just see a world where they're like, I don't know how to do this, so let's just not do it at all. And I think that in Narnia, come on, guys. There could be some warriors with dwarfism. We could Tyrion Lannister 2.0 it up. Like, come on. Like, we don't have to have the only representation of dwarfism be bad or no little people at all. I think that's such a weird trend that Hollywood's done in the last, 20 years. We had so much more representation of little people in the 80s and 90s and before that. And now that studios are like, oh, we can't just have dehumanizing, objectifying roles for little people. guess we're not gonna have any at all. The Witcher is so good at its dwarfism representation. They have not one, not two, not three, not four, but countless little people in that series, male and female, who are doing a fantastic job. They're so interesting to watch. The performers that they chose are truly so talented. Danny Wordburn, who was in Seinfeld, signed on for the newest season with Liam Hemsworth that's premiering sometime this year or next year. I'm so excited because he's a legend that needs to be working more and has earned his dues. But moving forward, I would love to see some more dwarfism representation in fantasy worlds. I think that there are endless possibilities for characters and casting opportunities within the fantasy space, and I think it would be awesome to explore actors with dwarfism, especially beyond Peter Dinklage, Warwick Davis, some of these people that we know and love, but introduce some new talent, because I think especially with fantasy, it's such a popular genre and it's such a great way to introduce new talents into the acting and, entertainment space, so that hopefully outside of these projects, these little people could also get work as well. I would love to see another movie like Willow. I was so sad to see the Disney Plus series get removed off the platform permanently only 6 months after premiere. It was written off for tax purposes, which means that legally Disney can no longer show the series even if they wanted to put it back. But I think Willow was such a special blend of storytelling, representation, adventure, magic, and I think that would be something really awesome to see come to life again. I know everyone hates reboots, so don't come for me, but I think they should get Willow a second chance. It needs a reboot. I'm sorry, I think it could be really popular even to this day if done right. I think I would have Warwick Davis, honestly, maybe even direct it or co-direct it or co-write it. I would have a really strong director like Denis Villeneuve, whatever his name is, from Dune. I honestly think could eat that up a little bit. I think it could be a mix between something a little bit more serious, but also something that felt family friendly and lighthearted. I think it could smash at the box office, especially with today's technology. The original film really pushed the boundaries with stunt performance and technology given the time it came out, and I think seeing a modern representation of that would be really awesome, especially knowing how many stunt performers exist with dwarfism that work on Star Wars, James Cameron's Avatar, and so many other action-adventure projects, Stranger Things, Marvel movies, and I think that you could definitely, for sure, cast little people in these roles, and it could feel fresh and different, and I don't know. Again, don't hate me because I suggested a reboot, but I just think that there was something really special with Willow that we should not forget. But anyways, I hope this clears some questions up for you guys. I'm curious to know what you guys think about some of the stuff that I talked about. If you've seen Game of Thrones, if you've seen Willow, if you've seen some of these other projects I've mentioned, and also if you knew about the whole separation between dwarves in fantasy and actual people with dwarfism. As always, please let me know in the comments down below. I love talking to you guys. My name is Aubrey Smalls, and until next time, I love you. Keep going.